Well, greetings, brethren. It's nice to be speaking today. It's a nice sunny day out. And last night I got some good news. My youngest son's wife gave birth to a baby girl. So that makes 11 grandchildren I have. But I think that'll be the last one. There's no more in the family that are, he's the youngest one, and all the other grandchildren are in the bag, you might say, already. So that was good news. The title of my sermon today is Staying in Your Lane Part 2. Now, in this sermon, Staying in Your Lane Part 1, I gave several examples of people who stepped over the line and went way off track in relations to their responsibilities they were given and the consequences of doing so. Now, some consequences were immediate and led to death or an instant plague of leprosy, as in the case of Marion. Some were delayed consequences of death, but they all suffered the consequences of their actions, and no one got away scot-free. Today I want to examine the lives of some faithful servants who stayed in their lane and the rewards they received for not compromising and being faithful to Christ as God of the Old Testament, His directions and instructions that He gave them. Now, in some of the things I'll be reading, it talks about God, but we understand that that's Christ because He's the God of the Old Testament. So the first one I want to look at is Noah. And I'll begin in Genesis 6. So in Genesis 6 and verse 1 it says, "Now it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born out to them, that the sons of men saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they choose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. So God determined that mankind would have 120 years left, that is, up until the flood. Going on in verse 5, Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and was grieved in his heart." Genesis 6:7. So God said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, creeping things and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I made them. Due to the sins of wickedness of man, they would all be destroyed. This shows that Christ was regretting having made man, but had a solution. And one man found favor with God. Over in Genesis 6:8, but Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. This is the genealogy of Noah. Noah was a just man, perfect in his generation. Noah walked with God. He was just and maintained purity in his genealogy, in the fact that there was no mixed blood in his generation, since in his family lineage from Adam to his generation. There was no mixed marriages, in other words. And with God implying obedience and faithfulness attributed to Noah. Over in Genesis 6 verse 11 it says, The earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. So God looked upon the earth, and indeed it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their ways on the earth. And God said to Noah, The end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth. In verse 14, Make yourself an ark of gopher wood, make rooms in the ark, and cover it inside and outside with pitch. So all flesh was corrupted, which means that their sins had to include bestiality. And God was going to destroy all flesh on the earth, which means not just man, but all living animals that were on the earth. He gave instructions to Noah on how to build the ark. And of course, this would not affect the fish and any animal that lives in the water continually. It would only mean air-breathing mammals and, of course, man. Over in Genesis 6:17, and behold, I myself am bringing floodwaters on the earth to destroy from under heaven all flesh in which is the breath of life. Everything that is on the earth shall die. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall go into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. And of every living thing of all flesh you shall bring 2 of every sort into the ark to keep them alive, and they shall be male and female. Of the birds after their kind, of animals after their kind, and every creeping thing of the earth after its kind, 2 of every kind will come to keep them alive. And verse 21, and you shall take for yourselves all food that is eaten, you shall gather it to yourselves, and you shall be food for you and for them. Thus Noah did according to all that God commanded, so he did. So Christ was going to bring the flood of waters on the earth, and the earth had not seen any rain up until that time. And if you go back to Genesis 1, it talks about how God was taking care of moisture for plants. And in Genesis 2 and verse 5, it says, before any plant of the field was in the earth, and before any herb of the field had grown, for the Lord God had not caused it to rain on the earth, and there was no man to till the ground. But a mist went up from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. So the plants and the grass were watered by a mist. And if you've ever walked on a foggy day, it's something like that. There's a lot of moisture and fog, and it would stick to them enough to water the plants so that they can reproduce. The people at that time were probably wondering what he was building because of the framework he had to start with, the frame of the boat. And they may have thought at first that he was building a large building, but as it took shape, they realized it was a boat, and quite a large boat. Some probably asked him why a boat miles from a lake or the ocean, and why not build it on the shores of the ocean or a lake. As it neared completion, they must have wondered how he was going to move this boat, 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high, to a source of water, most likely mocking him. Probably thought he'd lost his mind. And that was the biggest ship up until, I think, in the 40s. They hadn't built a ship that big, so it was a huge ship. And of course, there was nothing like that on the earth. So anyway, we're going on to Genesis 7 and verse 2. It says, you shall take with you 7 each of every clean animal, a male and his female, 2 each of the animals that are unclean, a male and a female. So he was taking more unclean animals more clean animals than unclean animals. And of every living thing of all flesh you shall bring 2 of every sort into the ark to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female. So 1 pair was enough to, once the ark was finished, once the water stopped and they let the animals out, 1 pair was enough of the unclean for them to multiply in what we have today. And of the birds after their kind, of animals after their kind, and every creeping thing of the earth after his kind, 2 of every kind will come to you to keep them alive. So God like through his spirit, and of course there's spirit animals too, he moved them to come to the ark. So Noah didn't have to go out and chase down all these animals. They came to the ark. And God did that for him. And you shall take for yourself of all food that is eaten, and you shall gather to yourselves, and it will be food for you and for them. Thus Noah did according to all that God commanded. So he did. Notice he did what God commanded him to do. And I imagine there was probably some stress building this thing for all those years, and people wondering what he's doing, probably making fun of him and the whole thing. In Genesis 7 and verse 3, it says, also 7 of each birds of the air, male and female, to keep the species alive on the face of the earth. So God ensured that the numbers that were going to the ark were enough to keep the species alive going forward. So Noah, his 3 sons, and their wives, plus the animals went into the ark. Then the rains came. In Genesis 7 and verse 10, and it came to pass after 7 days that the waters of the flood were on the earth. And in verse 12, and the rain was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. And dropping down to 20, the waters prevailed 15 cubits upward, about 22 feet, and the mountains were covered. So it went up to cover the mountains at the time. And all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds and cattle and beasts, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, and every man. So what was the actual reward for obeying God? His wife, his family were saved from the flood, and he lived 150 more years after the flood. So Noah lived after the flood 300, and this is in Genesis 9:28. Noah lived after the flood 350 years. Genesis 29. So all the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. So he lived a long time, but he lived several hundred years even after the flood. I said 150, but it's actually 350. I typed that down wrong. Anyway, the lesson here is it pays to obey God. I mean, sometimes you may wonder what's going on, and you have direct orders from God. You should do what you're told. The second one I want to look at is Jonah. It says in Jonah 1 and verse 3, Jonah was given instruction from God, and this was his reaction. But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship to Tarshish, so he paid the fare and went down into it to go with them to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. Now, God had told him to go to Nineveh and tell them that in 40 days they're all going to be destroyed. So for some reason, he was reluctant to do it and tried to escape. And I think the reason is explained in the 4th chapter. In verse 2, it says, so he prayed to the Lord and said, ah, Lord, was not this what I said when I was still in my country? Therefore I fled previously to Tarshish, for I know that you are a gracious and merciful God, slow to anger and abundant in loving kindness, and who relents from doing harm. So that's his thinking why he was trying to get away. So the ship hit a severe storm. And over in Jonah 1 and verse 11, it says, then they said to him, what shall we do that the sea may be calm for us? For the sea was growing more tempestuous. And he said to them, pick me up and throw me into the sea. Then the sea will become calm for you, for I know that this great tempest is because of me. Nevertheless, the men rowed hard to return to land, but they could not, for the sea continued to grow more tempestuous against them. And in verse 14, therefore they cried out to the Lord and said, we pray, O Lord, please do not let us perish for this man's life, and do not charge us with the innocent blood, for you, O Lord, have done as it pleased you. So they picked up Jonah and threw him into the sea, and the sea ceased from raging. Dropping down to verse 17, it says, Now the Lord had prepared a great fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and nights. Now I'm going over to Jonah 2 and verse 10. Jonah 2 and verse 10. It says, So the Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah on dry land. By this time, he probably figured out that he should follow God's instruction, because otherwise things weren't going too well for him. So over in Jonah 3 and verse 1, it says, Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah the second time, saying, Arise and go to Nineveh, that great city, and preach to it the message that I tell you. So Jonah arose and went to Nineveh, according to the word of the Lord. Now Nineveh was an exceedingly great city, a 3 days' journey. And Jonah began to enter the city the first day's walk. Then he cried out and said, Yet 40 days, and Nineveh shall be overthrown. So the people of Nineveh believed God, proclaimed the fast, and put on sackcloth from the greatest to the least of them. And over dropping down to verse 10, Then God saw their works, that they turned from their evil way, and God relented from the disaster that he had said he would bring upon them, and he did not do it. Verse 4 and verse 1. But it displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he became angry. And like I said, he became angry. He was really mad at God. His ego was hurt. Why would a person be mad for God having mercy on them? The Ninevites. You would think that he would be happy about it. But I think his ego was a bit hurt, and the fact that it didn't come to pass, it didn't make him look good, so that bothered him. And over in Jonah 4 and verse 4, Then the Lord said, Is it right for you to be angry? So Jonah went out of the city and sat on the east side of the city there. He made himself a shelter and sat under it in the shade till he might see what would become of the city. So he goes on the east side and waits to see what's going to happen. And the Lord God prepared a plant and made it come up over Jonah, that it might be shade for his head to deliver him from his misery. That's interesting. By this time he was miserable. So Jonah was very grateful for the plant. So at least he appreciated that. But as morning dawned and the next day, God prepared a worm, and it damaged the plant, and that it withered. And it happened when the sun arose that God prepared a vehement east wind, and the sun beat on Jonah's head so that he grew faint. Then he wished death for himself and said, It is better for me to die than to live. Yeah, woe is me. He felt so bad. And mind you, this is not the first recorded in the Bible, first place that people have felt, take my life. But that's how bad he felt. Then God said to Jonah, Is it right for you to be angry about the plant? And he said, It is right for me to be angry, even to death. But the Lord said, You have had pity on the plant for which you have not labored, nor made to grow, which came up in a night and perished in a night. And in verse 11, Should I not pity Nineveh, that great city in which are more than 120,000 persons who cannot discern between their right hand and their left, and much livestock? So Jonah, in the end, carried out the warning to Nineveh, and God kind of chided him because he felt bad about having pity on the plant, yet he was hoping the city would be destroyed so that he would not lose face from the warning he gave. So it shows he had a bit of an attitude problem. This shows that God is willing to relent on what he wanted to do when they repented and had care not just for the inhabitants, but also care for the animals. So I think this was a good lesson for Noah. when God gives you instructions, you don't look for ways to get away from them, but do them and accept what God decides, even if it's not what you said or were told, and then it didn't come to pass, because God's in charge at all times and he knows what's best, and he's a merciful God. So when they repented, he just relented. The third person I'd like to talk about is Abraham. Now over in Genesis 12, and we'll begin reading in verse 1, it says, "Now the Lord had said to Abraham, get out of your country, from your family, from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be blessed." So these are the pretty straightforward instructions. Is get away from his family into another land, and God would bless him and make a great nation of him. "I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you, and in all the families of the earth shall be blessed." And in verse 4, "So Abraham departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran." So he wasn't a spring chicken. He was already well on in age when God had told him to leave everything. But notice he didn't argue or complain or resist. He just went as he was told. And he didn't whine about it or argue. And in Genesis 15 and in verse 1, it says, "After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abraham in a vision, saying, Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your exceeding great reward." But Abram said, "Lord God, what will you give me, seeing I am childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer or of Damascus?" Then Abram said, "Look, you have given me no offspring. Indeed, one born of my house is my heir." And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "This one shall not be your heir, but one who will come from your own body shall be your heir." Then he brought him outside and said, "Look now towards heaven, count the stars if you are able to number them." And he said to him, "So shall your descendants be." In Genesis 15:6, he says, "And he believed in the Lord, and it was accounted to him for righteousness." So his belief was accounted to him for righteousness, that his descendants would be as large in number as the stars in heaven. Now, dropping down to Genesis 17 and verse 1, when Abraham was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abraham and he said, "I am God Almighty, walk before me." So he was 75 when he left Haran, and now he's 99, says 24 years later. "Walk with me," he said, "and be blameless. And I will make a covenant between me and you, and will multiply you exceedingly." Now he's 89. Well, I'm sorry, 98. And the original promise was made years before that, 20 some odd years. He had to be thinking, just when is this promise going to be kept? In his mind, he's been waiting all these years, 75 to 89, 24 years he's been waiting, no results yet. Then God said to Abraham, "As for Sarah, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai. You shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name." And in verse 16, "And I will bless her and give you a son by her. Then I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations, kings of peoples, of nations, kings and peoples shall be from her." And in verse 17, "Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said in his heart, Shall a child be born of a man 100 years old? and shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? So Abraham had a point there because, this is what, 28 years since the promise was made, and, not too many women at 90 bear children. And then Genesis 18:1, then the Lord appeared to him, this is a little bit later now, by the terebinth tree in Mamre, as he was sitting in the tent door in the heat of the day. So he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing by him. And when he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet him, bowed down himself to the ground. And in verse 10 it says, and he said, I will certainly return to you according to the time of life, and behold, Sarah your wife shall have a son. And Sarah was listening at the tent door, which was behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, well in advance in age, and Sarah had passed the age of childbearing. Yeah, that's an understatement. Therefore Sarah laughed within herself, saying, after I have grown old, I shall have pleasure, my Lord being old also. You can't blame him. You can't really blame her for laughing, when she's looking at it from a kind of a human point of view, but God had things in mind, the plans in mind. So in Genesis 21, a few chapters over, in verse 1, and the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had spoken. So God kept his word. He had planned this all along. For Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, and at the set time of which God had spoken to him. And Abraham called the name of his son, who was born to him, whom Sarah bore to him, Isaac. So after patiently waiting for almost 25 years, Abraham finally gets a son. Talk about patience. I mean, we get impatient if our prayers aren't answered in a short period of time. Imagine being anointed for something and waiting 25 years to be healed. I mean, people are so used to having instant gratification. They want everything right now. But I mean, Abraham, the patience of the man waiting 25 years, he never questioned it. I don't think he doubted, but that's sure a long time to wait. In Genesis 22 and verse 1, it says, now it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, here I am. And in verse 22, Genesis 22:2, then he said, take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him as a burnt offering on one of the mountains which I shall tell you. Now imagine being in his place. He waits 25 years to have a son. Now God wants him to sacrifice his son. Abraham did not complain. He just complied. Over in Genesis 22 and verse 9, then they came to the place of which God had told him, and Abraham built an altar there and placed the wood in order, and he bound his Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And in verse 10, then Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay him. In verse 11, but the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. So he said, here I am. And he said, do not lay your hands on the lad or do anything to harm him. Do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, and since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Notice his son did not resist. I mean, he could have been in his teens at the time, but he just didn't resist. This was the ultimate test for Abraham, and he complied without complaining. So notice God allowed him to reach the point of the knife coming down before he actually stopped it. So God knew that he would not even withhold his son from God, and it explains why Abraham is accounted for this as righteousness. Now, you think about this. God had a plan for Abraham. And this is a really big test. I mean, I don't think anybody has faced a test like that. So Abraham passed the test with flying colors in spite of waiting 25 years and then being told to sacrifice his son. You know, we're all tested in various ways. And the thing is, God doesn't push the test beyond what you can handle. And he mentions that in the New Testament. But Abraham was pushed to the edge of the cliff, you might say. But he trusted God and he was faithful. And that's why he's called the father of the faithful. God tests us also based on previous responses to test us if he can accurately to test us. When he tests us, he can accurately predict what the outcome will be based on your previous reaction to tests. Now, of course, he could go beyond that. You know, he has that capability, but I don't think he did that with Abraham. He could have went, you know, into the future and noticed what his reaction was, but based on Abraham's obedience and never complained, and God can't break his word, he just tested him, and he was prepared to slay his son. And I mean, God the Father had to allow Christ to be killed for our salvation now. So, you know, he didn't ask Abraham to do something. God didn't ask Abraham to do something that he did not do in relationship to his son, Jesus Christ, which is quite interesting when you think of it. The next person that I want to talk about is Joseph. And that's over in Genesis 37 and verse 1. It says, "Now Jacob dwelt in the land where his father was a stranger, in the land of Canaan." This is the history of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brothers, and the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to his father. And now, dropping down, verse 3. "Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children because he was the son of his old age. Also he made him a tunic of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him." So they spoke roughly to him. They were jealous, of course. "Now Joseph had a dream, and he told this to his brothers, and they hated him even more." In verse 6, "So he said to them, 'Please hear the dream which I have dreamed. There we were, binding sheaves in the field. Then behold, my sheaf rose and also stood upright, and indeed your sheaves stood all around and bowed down to my sheaf.' And his brother said to him, 'Shall you indeed reign over us? Or shall you indeed have dominion over us?' So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words." And in verse 9, "Then he dreamed still another dream and told it to his brothers and said, 'Look, I have dreamed another dream. And this time the sun, the moon, and 11 stars bowed down to me.' So he told it to his father and his brothers, and his father rebuked him and said to him, 'What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall your mother and I, your brothers, indeed come to bow down to the earth before you?' And his brothers envied him, but his father kept the matter in mind." And 37, verse 12, "Then his brothers went to feed their father's flock in Shechem, and Israel said to Joseph, 'Are not your brothers feeding the flock in Shechem? Come, I will send you to them.' So he said to him, 'Here I am.' Then he said to him, 'Please go and see if it is well with your brothers and well with the flocks, and bring back word to me.' So he sent him out of the valley of Hebron, and he went to Shechem. Dropping down to verse 23, so it came to pass when Joseph had come to his brothers that they stripped Joseph of his tunic, the tunic of many colors that was on him. Then they took him and cast him into a pit, and the pit was empty. There was no water in it. And they sat down to eat meat. Then they lifted their eyes and looked, and there was a company of Ishmaelites coming to Gilead with their camels, bearing spices, balm, and myrrh, and on their way carrying them down to Egypt. So Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is there if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh." And his brothers listened. Yeah, he wanted to make money on the deal. In verse 37, Genesis 37:28, then the Midianites traders passed by, so the brothers pulled Joseph up and lifted him up out of the pit, and told the Ishmaelites, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver, and they took Joseph to Egypt. Over in Genesis 3 and verse 72, it says that he was 17 years old at the time when they sold him to those traveling Ishmaelites. The brothers made Isaac believe Joseph had been killed. So this, to cover their plot up, they thought about this plan. So over in Genesis 37:31, so they took Joseph's tunic, killed the kid of the goats, and dipped the tunic in the blood. Then they set the tunic of many colors, and they brought it to their father and said, "We have found this. Do you know whether or not it's your son's tunic?" Now, come on. They knew that he would recognize the tunic, and he recognized it and said, "It is my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Without doubt, Joseph is torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his clothes, put sackcloth on his waist, and mourned for his son many days. And all his sons and all his daughters arose to comfort him. But he refused to be comforted and said, "For I shall go down into the grave to my son in mourning. For I shall go." Thus his father wept for him. In verse 36, now the Midianites had sold him to Egypt, to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guard. So this is what they did with Joseph. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. This is Genesis 39 and verse 1. And Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh's captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. And in verse 2, and the Lord was with Joseph, and he was successful, a successful man. And he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all he did to prosper in his hands. In verse 4, so Joseph found favor in his sight and served him. Then he made him overseer of his house, and all that he had he put under his authority. So he prospered because God was with him. God was blessing him. In spite of the fact he had been sold and he was in Egypt, God was with him and he blessed him. And in Genesis 39 and verse 7, and it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph, and she said, lie with me. And in verse 8, but he refused and said to his master's wife, look, my master does not know what is with me in the house, and he has committed all that he has into my hand. There is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you. Because you are his wife, how then can you do this great wickedness and sin against God?" That was quite a test when you think of it, for a young man being chased by the owner of the house, Potiphar's wife. And he also knew that it was wickedness and sin against God. So he was familiar about what sin was. So she tried again. He still refused her, and he landed up in prison. So in Genesis 39 and verse 21, "But the Lord was with Joseph. He was never abandoned, and showed him mercy, and he gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever they did, it was his doing. And the keeper of the prison did not look into anything that was under Joseph's authority." In other words, he trusted him 100%, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made to prosper. So for being faithful and not sinning, he lands up in prison. Seems bad, but he was put in charge over the prisoners because God was with him and looking out for him, and he was being blessed. And in Genesis 40, in verse 1, "It came to pass after these things that the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their lord, the king of Egypt." And in verse 2, "And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief butler and the chief baker. So he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison, the place where Joseph was confined." Over in Genesis 40 and verse 5, "Then the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, had a dream, both of them each man's dream in one night, and each man's dream with its own interpretation." And in verse 6, "Joseph came into them in the morning and looked at them and saw they were sad. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in the custody of his lord's house, saying, 'Why do you look sad today?' And in verse 8, "And they said to him, 'We each have had a dream, and there is no interpreter of it.' So Joseph said to them, 'Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell them to me, please.' Then the chief butler told his dream to Joseph and said to him, 'Behold, in my dream a vine was before me, and in the vine there were 3 branches, and it was as though it budded. Its blossoms shot forth, and its clusters brought forth red grapes. Then Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand.' And in verse 12, "And Joseph said to him, 'This is the interpretation of the 3 branches are 3 days. Now within 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your place, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand according to the former manner which you were when you were his butler. But remember me when it is well with you, and please show kindness to me. Make mention of me to Pharaoh to get me out of this house.'" Yeah, he wanted to get out of this prison. I'm tired of being in here. And verse 15, "For indeed I was stolen away from the land of the Hebrews, and also I have done nothing here that should put me into the dungeon." In other words, he had not done anything to be put into the dungeon. Not anything before God. I mean, obviously the wife had lied, and he was thrown in prison. When the baker saw that the interpretation was good, he said to Joseph, "I also was in my dream, and there were 3 white baskets on my head." In verse 17, "In the uppermost basket there were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, and the birds ate them out of the basket on my head." So Joseph answered and said, This is the interpretation. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat flesh from you. Then it came to pass on the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast for all his servants, and he lifted up the head of the chief butler and of the chief baker among his servants. Then he restored the chief butler to his butlership again, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker, as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief butler did not remember, but forgot him. So, Joseph had asked him not to forget. So he says, don't tell the Pharaoh what happens, basically what he said. So this, now 2 years later, it says Genesis 41:1. Then it came to pass, of course, by this time, Joseph was about 20. So it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream, and behold, he stood by the river, and suddenly there came up out of the river 7 cows, fine looking and fat, and they fed in the meadow. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them out of the river, ugly and gaunt, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the river. And the ugly and gaunt cows ate up the 7 fine-looking fat cows, so Pharaoh awoke. He slept and dreamed a second time, and suddenly 7 heads of grain came up on one stalk, plump and good. Then behold, 7 thin heads, blighted by the east winds, sprang up after them. And the 7 thin heads devoured the 7 plump and full heads. So Pharaoh awoke, and indeed it was a dream. Now in verse 8, now it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians in Egypt and all its wise men. And Pharaoh told them his dream, but there was no one who could interpret for Pharaoh. Then the chief butler spoke to Pharaoh, saying, I remember my faults today, when Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, both me and the chief baker. We each had a dream in one night. He and I, each of us dreamed according to the interpretation of his own dream. Now there was a young Hebrew man with us there, a servant of the captain of the guard, and we told him, and he interpreted the dream for us. To each man he interpreted according to his own dream. In Genesis 41:13, and it came to pass, as he interpreted for us, so it happened. He restored me to my office, and he hanged him. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him to him quickly out of the dungeon, and he shaved and changed his clothing and came to the Pharaoh. Joseph interprets the dream, and this is what happened. In verse 39, then Pharaoh said to Joseph, inasmuch as God has shown you all this, there is no one as discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house and all my people, and be ruler. Rule according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you. This is after he interpreted the dream. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. So at this time, he was 30 years old. So from prison to second in command. So he really rose up, but still he was 17 when he was thrown in, and now he was 30 years old. That's 13 years later. And Genesis in 42:1, and it says that when Jacob saw that there was grain in Egypt, Jacob said to his sons, "Why do you look at one another?" And he said, "Indeed, I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down to that place and buy it there. Buy it for us there, that we may live and not die." So Joseph's 10 brothers went down to buy grain in Egypt. But Jacob did not send Joseph's brother Benjamin with his brothers, for he said, "Lest some calamity befall him." And the sons of Israel went to buy grain among those who journeyed, for the famine was in the land of Canaan. Now Joseph was governor over the land, and it was he who sold to all the people in the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed down before him, and their faces to the earth. Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them, but he acted as a stranger to them and spoke roughly to them. Then he said to them, "Where do you come from?" And they said, "From the land of Canaan, to buy food." So Joseph recognized his brothers, but they did not recognize him. Then Joseph remembered the dreams which he had dreamed about, and said to them, "You are spies. You have come to see the nakedness of the land." And they said to him, "No, my lord, but your servants have come to buy food." And in verse 11, "We are all men of the same. We are all one man's sons. We are honest men. Your servants are not spies." In Genesis 43, verse 24, "So the man brought the men unto Joseph's house and gave them water, and they washed their feet, and he gave them their donkeys feed. Then they made the present ready, and Joseph's coming at noon, for they heard that he would be eating there. And when Joseph came home, they brought him the present which was in their hand into the house, and bowed down before the earth. Then he asked them about the well-being, and said, "Is your father well? The old man whom you spoke, is he still alive?" And they answered, "Your servant, your father, is in good health and still alive." And they bowed their heads down and prostrated themselves. Then he lifted his eyes and saw his brother Benjamin and his mother's son, and said, "Is this your younger brother, of whom you spoke to me?" And he said, "God be gracious to you, my son." Now his heart yearned for his brother, so Joseph made haste and sought somewhere to weep. And he went into the chamber and wept there. And he washed his face and came out, and he restrained himself and said, "Serve the bread." So they set him in place by himself, and them by themselves, and the Egyptians who ate with them by themselves, because the Egyptians could not eat food with the Hebrews, for that is an abomination to the Egyptians. And they sat before him, the firstborn according to his birthright, and the youngest according to his youth. And the men looked astonished at one another. They were wondering what was going on here. Then he took the servings to them before him, but Benjamin's serving was 5 times as much as theirs, so they drank and they were merry with him. And Genesis 45 and verse 1, "Then Joseph could not restrain himself before all those who stood by him, and cried out, 'Make everyone go out from me.' So one stood with him, while Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept aloud, and the Egyptians in the house of Pharaoh heard it. And Joseph said to his brothers, 'I am Joseph, does my father still live?' But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. And Joseph said to his brothers, 'Please come near to me.' So they came near to him, and he said, 'I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. For these 2 years the famine has been in the land, and there are still 5 years of which there will be neither plowing or harvesting. And God sent him before you to preserve a prosperity for you in the earth, and to save our lives by a great deliverance.' This is what God had planned, and it took some 32 years to bring it to fruition." In Genesis 45 and verse 17, "And Pharaoh said to Joseph, Say to your brothers, do this. Load your animals and depart and go to the land of Canaan and bring your father and your household and come to me, and I will give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you will eat the fat of the land. And then in Genesis 46 and verse 2, then God spoke to Israel in the visions of the night and said, Jacob, Jacob, and he said, here I am. So he said, I am God, the God of your father. Do not fear, go down to Egypt, for I will make you a great nation. I will go down with you to Egypt, and I will surely bring you up again, and Joseph will put his hand on your eyes. Then Jacob arose from Beersheba, and the sons of Israel carried their father Jacob, their little ones and their wives in carts with Pharaoh, and he sent to carry him. So they took their livestock and their goods which they had acquired in the land of Canaan and went to Egypt, and Jacob and all his descendants with him. In Genesis 46, verse 29, so Joseph made ready his chariot and went up to Goshen to meet his father Israel, and he presented himself to him and fell on his neck and wept on his neck a good while. And Israel said to Joseph, now let me die, since I have seen you face to face, and you are still alive. So from the time that he was sold to a caravan and landed in Egypt, God blessed him. He found favor with Potiphar, and after some 13 years in prison, God worked with him to promote him to second command in Egypt. He's able to meet his brother Benjamin and eventually his father Isaac, and the whole family settled in Egypt. So Joseph was faithful and he had character, and God used him to save the whole family from starvation, and they all settled in the land of Egypt. And at the time Joseph was 30 years old. So God worked it all out, and that was planned by God well in advance, but it just took time to come to fruition. So, I mean, it shows again, 13 years before things were resolved, not as long as Abraham, but it just shows how God can work things out. Now, there are others I just want to mention, because I don't have the time to go over their stories, but I do want to mention Daniel. He was faithful to God and found favor with God's eyes, and he wouldn't compromise when the other people there associated with the king conspired against him, and they said, if someone doesn't pray to any other god but your God, thrown to the lions. And Daniel wasn't afraid about that. He went up to his window and prayed towards Jerusalem, as it was custom. And then, of course, that was told to the king, and he threw him in the lion's den. And the king had a lot of love for Daniel, which was shown because he got up early in the morning and he went up to the cave, and he says, Daniel, are you okay? And Daniel says, yes, one of God's angels came and the lions didn't hurt me. And the king really was happy about that, but it didn't work out too good for those that had plotted against him, because they were thrown into the lion's den with their families, and the lions crushed and killed them. Also, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when they had this big statue and they were all supposed to bow down at a certain time when they played these instruments, and they just refused to do it because they knew that was wrong, and they weren't going to bow down to any idols. And Nebuchadnezzar got really mad and threw them into the fire, a big furnace. They heated it up way more than what it's used to. And he looked and he says, well, I thought we threw men down there, and I see 4 walking around. And then finally they brought him out, and they didn't even have the smell of smoke on them. So God backed them up for their faithfulness. So it just goes to show, brethren, that if you're facing a trial, you just got to put your faith and trust in God. I mean, Christ, Paul, with all he went through, I mean, you read the list of all the things he went through, and yet at the end he said, I'm at the end of my rope, I'm paraphrasing, I'm at the end of my life, And I'm looking forward to this crown that's there for me. So regardless of the trials we face, we've got to keep our eyes focused on the crown that is just ahead of us. And hopefully it's not too long, because some of us are getting older. And, if it's too long, we might not be around. That's all in God's hands. I know Christ said, pray that it may be worthy to escape and go to the place of safety. But here again, if that doesn't happen, you got to trust God if you have to go through the tribulation, that in the end, you will be in the kingdom and you'll get your crown as promised. So it's something to look forward to, and it puts onus on us not to get caught up in compromise and fulfill the responsibilities that we're all given, some less, some more. So brethren, let's make sure we keep our eyes on the goal and are crowned and remain faithful to all that God instructs us through his servants. So